change as you develop from a fetus to a newborn. So I have to first give you the caveat that I am a PhD physiologist. I'm not qualified to tell you how to take care of babies. You are all much better at that than I am. But what I do is I use animal models to try and learn what regulates brain blood flow in the normal situation and under conditions of stress. If you were over here looking at this direction, this is what you would see today. They've actually finished the outside of the building. It's not open until sometime in 2020, but it's a very large new hospital that we're excited to get up and running in the next couple of years. So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about this morning. I hope to talk a little bit about the things that determine cerebral blood flow in the fetus and in the newborn, how cerebral blood flow responds to changes in blood pressure, how it responds to changes in oxygen delivery to the brain, and whether these mechanisms change as you develop from a fetus to a newborn. So I have to first give you the caveat that I am a PhD physiologist. I'm not qualified to tell you how to take care of babies. You are all much better at that than I am. But what I do is I use animal models to try and learn what regulates brain blood flow in the normal situation and under conditions of stress. And the sheep is probably the most useful model for this in terms of fetal and neonatal physiology, so we often study the sheep. So while I can't help your babies, if you ever have a very sick sheep and you want to send them to Loma Linda, I promise I will do my best to take care of them and make them healthy. But one reason why sheep are so useful for this is that we can do a surgery and instrument the fetal sheep in utero. So we take a pregnant ewe and we do a sterile surgery. We can put catheters into the arteries and veins of the fetus and externalize those to the outside of the ewe. We can put a flow probe into the brain, which measures brain blood flow. So this is, if we zoom in on the tip, very tip of this probe, it looks like this. It's about 1/2 millimeter in diameter, so very small fiber optic technology that you can put into the brain, which uses 2 fiber optics to measure brain blood flow by Doppler flowmetry, and uses another fiber optic probe that can measure the tissue PO2 in the region surrounding the tip of this probe, which we can plant into the cerebral cortex. So we'll do this surgery in this animal, we'll sew everything back up, we let the ewe recover, and then we can study the fetus in utero without anesthesia for 1 or 2 weeks sometimes. We can do these experiments. So here's the ewe standing on the cart. We have her connected to the computer so we can measure fetal blood pressure and brain blood flow while we do whatever the protocol calls for studying. So some examples of how the sheep has been useful for learning about fetal physiology. This is where the first idea or the first studies were done that showed that cooling is effective for treating HIV. Alistair Gunn and his team down in New Zealand led some experiments where they actually cooled fetal sheep in utero after exposing them to a 10-minute or 15-minute cord occlusion, and they showed that it was very protective in the brain. The sheep have also been instrumental in introducing the therapies of antenatal steroids. Exogenous surfactant was given to newborn sheep to test the safety and efficacy of that. Inhaled nitric oxide was developed in newborn lambs. Sheep were the first newborn animal model that was studied with ECMO. And currently there's a lot of research going on that's getting a lot of media in the United States, at least with an artificial placenta. So being able to take preterm, eventually babies, they're doing this in preterm sheep and cannulate the umbilical cord and basically keep them on artificial placenta. So the sheep have been pretty productive in teaching us new therapies and treatments for neonatology. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cerebral blood flow and the main factors that govern this, and try and make it, those of us who study brain blood flow, we simplify it into just simple plumbing, basically. So we know that pressure between the arteries and the vein, and the resistance to flow, which means the caliber or the diameter of the blood vessels, the resistance blood vessels in the brain that can contract and relax. So flow can be determined by cardiac output. On the arterial side, cardiac output can regulate the pressures of the blood coming into the brain, and the venous outflow can also have a significant effect on cerebral blood flow. So if you have high intrathoracic pressures, or even if the head is not turned to midline, you can impede jugular venous outflow, and that can have a dramatic effect on brain blood flow and the pressure that the vessels in the brain are actually exposed to. Then the vessels themselves can contract and relax, and there's many factors that control that, such as the PO2, the PCO2. There's many vasoactive metabolites of the neurons that fire that can constrict or relax the blood vessels. And then neuronal activity itself stimulates vasodilation of the blood vessels in that region to increase brain blood flow and oxygen delivery. And then the other factor that comes into play with the regulation of brain blood flow is the neural innervation of the arteries in the brain. So these are innervated by sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. When those fire, they can mostly constrict cerebral arteries and decrease brain blood flow. So the first concept of how brain blood flow is regulated that I'll go over here is autoregulation of brain blood flow. And this term, the term autoregulation of blood flow, refers to the phenomenon whereby blood flow can be maintained at a relatively constant level despite big changes in arterial blood pressure or perfusion pressure across the brain. And so what that means is as blood pressure increases, the blood vessels in the brain need to constrict, decrease their diameter. As blood pressure decreases, the blood vessels need to vasodilate so that flow can be maintained at the same level despite these pressure changes. There's basically three mechanisms that we know of that mediate autoregulation of brain blood flow. The first is just an intrinsic response within the arteries. So in my laboratory, some experiments we can do where we take out the resistance vessels from the brain, and we can study those isolated in a vessel bath. And even an isolated artery, if you subject it to an increase in pressure, intraluminal pressure, it will constrict against that pressure. So there are ion channels that are activated by stretch, and so when the vessel distends, they contract and press back against that intraluminal pressure. So this is one factor that causes vasoconstriction as blood pressure increases. There's also the local tissue metabolites that I told you about. If there's local hypoxia or local neuronal activity, things like adenosine and nitric oxide are produced. Those will cause vasodilation to increase brain blood flow. And then there's the autonomic innervation, which has been less well characterized, certainly in the newborn. But the idea here is that as systemic blood pressure increases, there may be some activation of the nerves, the sympathetic nerves that innervate the brain, that would constrict in order to reduce the increase in brain blood flow that might be caused by hypertension. So autoregulation has been measured. These are all sheep studies, fetal sheep studies. It's been measured by many different labs over the years. This is the type of data that you get. So here's a study in 110-day fetal sheep, and they showed that as they varied the blood pressure of the animal experimentally across a wide range, they see a relatively stable brain blood flow for at least a certain range of those blood pressures. If they got in these 110-day-old fetuses, which are preterm animals, term for a sheep is about 145 to 147 days. So these are relatively preterm, but even then, in utero, these fetuses are able to maintain stable brain blood flow until the blood pressures get up to this level, right around 50 or 60 millimeters of mercury. And then in 120-day-old animals, this is another study that they also measured this plateau of autoregulation, and if pressures got up above 80 millimeters of mercury, they lost the autoregulation. So that was the upper limit of autoregulation in those animals. This study back here again, now they're studying 128-day animals, and they found this plateau of autoregulation that went beyond 90 millimeters of mercury arterial blood pressure. So they were not able to get the blood pressure high enough to go above the upper limit of autoregulation in these near-term animals. So this timeline shows the age of fetal sheep, and I've shown here all the studies that I've found where they've actually measured autoregulation of brain blood flow over the years. And so all of these studies have found adequate autoregulation in the fetal sheep and in the newborn sheep. These are 7-day-old and 10-day-old lambs. They also have good autoregulation of brain blood flow. The only one that did not find autoregulation was this study by Pelu et al. At 92, I think it was 91 or 92-day-old fetuses. And so that's actually slightly, well, it's toward the end of the second trimester. It appears that autoregulation is not developed at that age. That's the only study that has not been able to observe autoregulation. So the curves of autoregulation look similar, but one thing to point out is that the younger the animal is, the more it's shifted to the left. Right? So as I showed you here, the upper limit of regulation for these 110-day-old animals was around 50 to 60 millimeters of mercury, and the lower limit is around 20 millimeters of mercury. If you look at the 128-day-old animals, their lower limit is higher than the preterm animals, and they have no upper limit. So the plateau of autoregulation shifts to the right as you get developmentally older. So one of the studies that my lab did to look at this was we were interested in that sympathetic innervation of the cerebral vasculature and how important is that for regulating or mediating autoregulation in the newborn lambs. I had a neonatal fellow working with me at the time who was interested in this, Adam Chinsky. And the study that we designed was to instrument fetal sheep or newborn animals. We compared preterm fetal sheep to 10-day-old newborn lambs. And we instrumented them with occluders on the aorta and on the brachiocephalic trunk as a way to manipulate the blood pressure. So if we occluded the descending aorta, then we would get increased blood pressure flowing up to the brain. If we occluded the brachiocephalic trunk, we could gradually decrease blood flow of the blood going up to the brain. So that's how we manipulated blood pressure. And then we also gave boluses of norepinephrine and angiotensin to get increased blood pressure while we measured the brain blood flow. So we went through a protocol where we did these graded changes in arterial blood pressure while we measured brain blood flow. And then we surgically removed one of the superior cervical ganglions. So these are ganglion that are at the carotid artery where it bifurcates into the internal and external arteries. And that is where the innervation of the cerebral arteries extends from. So we removed one of those on the right side to try and decrease or eliminate the neural control of brain blood flow on that side. Before doing that, just to test whether these ganglia could mediate brain blood flow, we stimulated them electrically, and this is what we would see. So when we stimulate the ganglia, we saw no change in systemic blood pressure. But when we would measure brain blood flow, we're measuring on both sides of the brain. The side of the brain that we were stimulating showed a marked decrease in brain blood flow, and the other side of the brain had no decrease in brain blood flow. If we calculate vascular resistance, you can see that the side of the brain where we were stimulating the superior cervical ganglion was markedly constricted, where the other side of the brain had very little change. So definitely this innervation to the cerebral vasculature is capable of causing vasoconstriction pretty potently in the cerebral arteries. This is consistent with some previous studies that have been done. Get back to where I was here. In lambs down in Australia, where they showed when they would increase the arterial blood pressure of the newborn lambs while they were measuring the electrical activity in the superior cervical ganglion, just a simple increase in arterial blood pressure caused a significant increase in neuronal activity of the cervical ganglion. So there's evidence from that side as well that there's a linkage between blood pressure and activity of these neurons that can cause vasoconstriction in the brain. So here's our data. After we made all those manipulations of arterial blood pressure, these are percent of the baseline. And the 10-day-old lambs, these are the curves that we get comparing blood pressure changes to brain blood flow. And that plateau that we get for autoregulation is this blue line here. So basically, we were not able to increase the blood pressure high enough to go above the limit of autoregulation in these 10-day-old lambs. So they have very good autoregulation under hypertensive conditions. They started the experiment at their baseline blood pressure near the lower limit of autoregulation. So if we decreased blood pressure at all from there, their cerebral blood flow fell. In the preterm lambs, it was a very different story. And then when we removed the SCG in the newborn lambs, there was a slight loss of autoregulation at the high blood pressure. So this says that the superior cervical ganglion in these 10-day-old lambs is at least partially responsible for autoregulation, but it's probably really only important at very high blood pressure. So we had to get the blood pressure almost twice as high as normal before we could see an effect of having removed the SCG. Okay, then in the preterm animals, the surprising thing in these animals was that we found these are preterm animals that we had delivered by a C-section. They're about 2 hours old, and we had assumed that they would have good autoregulation based on all of those studies that I showed you previously, which have always found autoregulation in preterm lambs. Surprisingly, what we found is that in these 2-hour-old lambs, they have no autoregulation at all. So this was actually the first study to take preterm lambs and deliver them and then study them as preterm newborns. And we had just expected that we would see autoregulation like they always have in preterm animal studies. That's not the case. They lose autoregulation completely. And so, of course, when we remove the superior cervical ganglion, there's still no autoregulation there. So this was an unexpected finding in this study, and we're hoping to do more work to figure out what is it about being born as a preterm that causes them to lose autoregulation. When I talk to neonatologists like you, often there's not a lot of surprise at this data because I think the feeling is that preterm neonates do have poor autoregulation. It's difficult to study, but the studies that have been done in humans indicate that they probably don't have very good autoregulation. And so maybe this will be a good model for us to start studying what is it about the preterm newborn that causes them to lose autoregulation. Okay, so the one other way that we study brain blood flow is to expose the brain to hypoxia. And things that govern brain blood flow are metabolic rate of the brain itself. The more oxygen it's consuming, the more oxygen you want to be delivered to the brain. And there's mechanisms that control brain blood flow to match the oxygen delivery to the metabolic rate. And then if there is inadequate oxygen being delivered, to match that metabolic rate, that's also a factor that can cause changes in brain blood flow. So there's a list of things that can cause inadequate or over-adequate oxygen delivery. These have all been studied in newborn lambs, and we find that they have a significant effect on brain blood flow. So the one I'm going to talk to you about is hypoxia. And how do we study hypoxia? There's several different ways you can make the fetus hypoxic. You can decrease umbilical blood flow in the lamb. You can decrease uterine blood flow in the ewe. You can decrease fetal cardiac output. You can make the fetus anemic. It's one that I didn't put on this list. The one that we study the most often is the bottom of the list here. We simply decrease the inspired oxygen of the ewe. We put a mask over her and give her an FiO2 of 10 to 12%. And that lowers the fetal arterial blood gases enough to stimulate this brain blood flow response. So by decreasing the ewe's FiO2 to 10 to 12%, this is the fetal arterial blood gas. It falls from about 23 down to around 10 millimeters of mercury. The ewe hyperventilates a little bit, so there's a small decrease in PCO2 in the fetus as a result of the ewe hyperventilating. The heart rate of the fetus falls, as you probably would expect. It's similar in humans. And blood pressure of the fetus increases in response to hypoxia. So what happens to the brain PO2 and brain blood flow? We see that brain tissue PO2 under this type of hypoxic stress falls from the normal levels of the fetus, which is around 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury, down to 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury. So it's a pretty severe hypoxia. Mitochondria need about 0.5 to 1 millimeter of mercury oxygen in order to even utilize that for metabolism. So this is a severe hypoxia. And brain blood flow increases by about 25% above baseline during that hypoxia. So the question is, we have an increase in blood pressure and an increase in blood flow. Is this brain blood flow increasing simply because the arterial blood pressure increased, or is it because there's an active vasodilation of the cerebral arteries? And so we can calculate the resistance change in response to this hypoxia. And what that looks like is down here. So if we calculate the resistance based on the blood pressure and the cerebral blood flow, you can see that there's a small decrease in cerebral vascular resistance. So what most of the studies find is that in response to hypoxia, you get an increase in blood pressure and a slight vasodilation in the cerebral arteries to both of those together increase brain blood flow. This just shows some studies find a significant decrease in cerebral vascular resistance and some find no significant change. So clearly you need the increase in blood pressure. There's probably some cerebral vasodilation, but that's maybe not as important of a component. This is just another study where they sympathectomize the sheep and expose them to hypoxia. That eliminates the increase in blood pressure. You don't have that sympathetic response to hypoxia. But yet in that study, they still saw an increase in brain blood flow. So that's more evidence that the blood vessels in the brain actually vasodilated in response to hypoxia. The mediators of that, we know adenosine and nitric oxide are involved. There's probably other vasodilators that are responsible for that vasodilation in the brain. So to summarize, we know that autoregulation of cerebral blood flow is intact in the normal and preterm fetus and the newborn, at least in sheep, except for immediately after birth. This is kind of a new finding that we're actively studying right now. Autoregulation of the newborn is not solely dependent upon sympathetic innervation. Hypoxic increases in cerebral blood flow are intact in the normal preterm and term fetus and newborn. And hypoxic cerebral blood flow increase is the result of both cerebral vasodilation and increased arterial blood pressure. These are some of the members of my lab. It's a little bit outdated picture, but it takes a big team of us to do all of these experiments, especially this person, Shannon Bragg, is my sheep surgeon. She's been doing these sheep surgeries for 25 or 30 years now, so she's the expert that makes this happen. And we could also not do this without our sheep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Block, for presenting this very tough topic in this